Forget everything you think you know about Turkey's relationship with NATO. What happened in the pre-dawn hours of May 4th is not a diplomatic gesture. It is not a symbolic protest. It is the most significant strategic realignment in the Black Sea theater since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if you are getting your information from mainstream press briefings, you are being told a version of events that deliberately obscures what actually occurred. Let me be clear about something the Pentagon is desperately hoping you will not understand. Turkey closed the Bosphorus Strait under Article 20 of the Montreux Convention, and at this moment, approximately 200 NATO naval vessels are trapped on the wrong side of that choke point with no legal mechanism to exit the Black Sea theater. Having spent decades in military intelligence environments, having sat in operational planning cells where these exact contingencies were war-gamed, I need you to understand that this is not routine maritime traffic management. This is Turkey executing a strategic veto over the entire NATO naval presence in a theater that 3 weeks ago was considered an operational lake for Western power projection. The sequence of events that led to this moment began not this week, but 17 months ago, when Turkish President Erdogan first signaled that Ankara's tolerance for NATO expansion into what Turkey considers its historic sphere of influence had reached terminal limits. But what you saw reported as diplomatic friction over Sweden's NATO membership, what you read about as complaints over F-16 sales, those were surface manifestations of a much deeper strategic calculation. The triggering event occurred at 0247 hours local time on May 4th when Turkish Coast Guard vessels took up blocking positions at both the northern and southern approaches to the Bosphorus Strait. Within 90 minutes, all commercial and military transit through the strait ceased completely. By 0600 hours, the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs had transmitted formal notifications to every NATO member state and to the Russian Federation, citing Article 20 of the 1936 Montreux Convention, which grants Turkey the right to close the straits to all foreign warships when Turkey considers itself threatened or when Turkey is engaged in armed conflict. Now, stay with me because what I am about to explain is why every naval planner in Brussels is having the worst day of their professional career. The Bosphorus Strait is not merely a waterway, it is the only maritime corridor connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. It is 17 nautical miles long at its maximum extent and narrows to 700 meters at its tightest point near the Rumeli fortress. That width, 700 meters, is barely sufficient for two-way traffic of large commercial vessels under optimal conditions. For military vessels, particularly aircraft carriers and amphibious assault ships, the margin for navigation error is measured in tens of meters. The current that runs through the strait averages 3 to 5 knots southbound in the surface layer, which means any vessel attempting forced passage against Turkish closure would be fighting both the current and the very real possibility of coastal artillery fire from positions that have commanded this choke point for 6 centuries. Let me walk you through exactly what is trapped on the northern side of that closure right now. The United States has Carrier Strike Group 12 operating in the Black Sea, built around the USS Harry S. Truman, a Nimitz-class carrier displacing 97,000 tons with an air wing of approximately 64 aircraft. That strike group includes the guided missile cruiser USS Gettysburg with its Aegis combat system, 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, and the fast combat support ship USNS Arctic. That represents approximately 14,000 American sailors and Marines. The British have the Queen Elizabeth-class carrier HMS Prince of Wales operating with its escort group, another 3,200 personnel. France deployed the Charles de Gaulle carrier group 3 weeks ago, adding 2,000 more sailors. Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland have contributed destroyer and frigate elements. When you aggregate the entire NATO presence that entered the Black Sea over the past 8 months under what was described as routine freedom of navigation operations and enhanced forward presence, you are looking at somewhere between 200 and 240 vessels, depending on how you count auxiliary and support ships. The vast majority of those vessels cannot remain on station indefinitely. They are not configured for sustained independent operations without regular resupply, crew rotation, and maintenance access that requires returning to home ports. Before we go any further, I need you to understand the legal framework that makes this closure practically irreversible under international law. The Montreux Convention was signed in 1936 specifically to give Turkey sovereign control over the Turkish Straits while balancing the interests of Black Sea powers and global maritime commerce. Under the convention, Turkey has absolute authority to regulate transit by warships. Article 20 grants Turkey the right to close the straits entirely to all foreign warships if Turkey considers itself threatened or if Turkey is at war. The key phrase is considers itself threatened. Turkey does not need to prove actual threat to NATO satisfaction. Turkey does not need Security Council authorization. Turkey makes that determination unilaterally, and its decision is final under the treaty framework that every NATO member state has recognized for 89 years. What the mainstream coverage is not telling you is that once Turkey invokes Article 20, there is no international legal mechanism to compel reopening. The closure can persist as long as Turkey maintains that the threatening condition exists. We are not talking about days or weeks. We are talking about a strategic fait accompli that could persist for months or longer. Keep watching because the next part is where everything starts to unravel. The trapped NATO vessels face a logistical crisis that most defense analysts have not even begun to process publicly. Modern naval vessels are not designed for indefinite deployment without port access. A Nimitz-class carrier consumes approximately 600,000 gallons of fuel per week when conducting flight operations. The aircraft embarked on those carriers require spare parts, munitions replenishment, and maintenance cycles that were planned around regular port calls that are now impossible. The crews aboard these vessels were deployed under rotation schedules that assumed they would return to home ports within 4 to 6 months. Those schedules are now meaningless. The food stores aboard these vessels, the medical supplies, the basic consumables required to sustain 20,000 personnel across a carrier strike group, all of it was calculated based on resupply chains that ran through the Mediterranean and relied on transit through the Bosphorus. That resupply is now cut off. Let me tell you what this really means from an operational standpoint. Within 7 to 10 days, these vessels will begin experiencing part shortages that affect combat readiness. Aircraft maintenance will start slipping. Within 3 weeks, food supplies will require rationing. Within 30 days, you will have ships operating at degraded capability with crews under psychological stress from extended deployment with no clear exit timeline. And here is what no Pentagon briefing will address directly. The only alternative exit route from the Black Sea is overland through Romania or Bulgaria, which means abandoning the vessels entirely or negotiating some kind of emergency transit agreement with Turkey that would require NATO to accept Turkish terms for reopening. Neither option is operationally acceptable, which means NATO is facing the choice between leaving a massive naval presence trapped indefinitely or engaging in negotiations with Turkey from a position of complete strategic disadvantage. What I have not yet told you is where this truly becomes dangerous. Turkey did not close the Bosphorus in isolation. This action occurred within 48 hours of a Russian Ministry of Defense announcement that Russian Black Sea Fleet elements would be conducting live fire exercises across the northwestern quadrant of the Black Sea. Those exercises position Russian naval and air assets between the trapped NATO vessels and their theoretical escape routes through Ukrainian or Georgian ports, neither of which offers viable logistics infrastructure for sustaining a fleet of this magnitude anyway. Russia is not threatening direct action against NATO vessels, but Russia is making absolutely certain that NATO understands the strategic environment has fundamentally shifted. The Black Sea is no longer a NATO lake where American carriers operate with impunity. It is now a contested maritime space where Turkey controls the only exit and Russia controls the operational environment. This is not just about ships stuck in a waterway. This is about the complete inversion of strategic assumptions that have governed NATO planning for 3 decades. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO has operated under the presumption that it could project power into any theater without facing choke point control by actors outside the alliance framework. The Bosphorus closure destroys that assumption. It demonstrates that Turkey, despite being a NATO member, will exercise sovereign prerogative in ways that directly contradict alliance operational plans when Turkish national interests diverge from broader NATO objectives. And here is the civilizational implication that should keep you awake tonight. If Turkey can do this in the Black Sea, what prevents Egypt from doing something similar with the Suez Canal? What prevents any choke point state from asserting sovereign control in ways that fragment the global maritime commons that American and European power projection depends on? The decisions being made right now in Ankara, in Brussels, in Washington, in Moscow, these are decisions that will determine whether we are witnessing a temporary diplomatic crisis or the beginning of a systemic fracture in the post-Cold War security architecture. Turkey's closure of the Bosphorus is not a tactic in some negotiation over F-16 sales. It is a strategic statement that the era of automatic alignment between Turkish interests and NATO interests has ended. Erdogan is signaling that Turkey will act as an independent power pursuing its own regional hegemonic ambitions, and if that means stranding 200 NATO warships in the Black Sea until alliance members acknowledge Turkish equities, then that is a price Ankara is willing to impose. The next 72 hours will be critical. Watch for emergency NATO ministerial meetings. Watch for back-channel diplomatic engagement between Washington and Ankara that will not appear in press briefings. Watch for whether Russia begins applying additional pressure on the trapped fleet through close approaches or electromagnetic harassment. Watch for whether any NATO member attempts to challenge the closure legally through the International Court of Justice, which would be futile but politically symbolic. Most importantly, watch for how long the mainstream media continues describing this as routine maritime traffic management before the reality of the strategic trap becomes undeniable. I am not offering you predictions with absolute certainty. Events of this magnitude involve too many variables and too many actors with conflicting interests for anyone to forecast outcomes with precision. What I am telling you is that the strategic calculus governing Mediterranean and Black Sea security just experienced a seismic shift. The assumptions that guided NATO planning for the past 3 decades no longer hold. Turkey just demonstrated that a single choke point state can impose strategic paralysis on the most powerful military alliance in human history. That demonstration will not be lost on other states that control critical maritime passages. We are watching the early stages of a multipolar world where regional powers assert sovereignty in ways that directly challenge American assumptions about freedom of navigation and unchallenged power projection. By the time you watch this, diplomatic efforts will be underway to resolve the crisis through negotiation. Those negotiations will involve compromises that NATO would have considered unthinkable 6 months ago. Turkey will extract concessions on Syria policy, on Kurdish autonomy issues, on weapons sales, on EU accession talks that have stalled for 2 decades. Erdogan holds all the leverage because he controls the only exit from a maritime trap that NATO sailed into voluntarily. The question is not whether NATO will eventually secure transit rights for the trapped vessels. The question is what price NATO will pay and what precedent will be established for future assertions of choke point control by states that decide their sovereign interests outweigh alliance obligations. This is the reality no official briefing will address honestly. This is the strategic vulnerability that decades of NATO expansion never adequately confronted. And this is why I keep telling you that the world order you thought was stable is fracturing in real time. Turkey just closed the door on 200 NATO warships, and there is no key except the one Erdogan holds. Everything else is negotiation over terms of release from a strategic trap that should never have been possible inside a functioning military alliance. Stay informed, stay skeptical of official narratives that minimize what just occurred, and understand that what happens next will reveal whether NATO retains strategic coherence or whether we just witness the beginning of alliance fragmentation under pressure from actors willing to exercise sovereign power regardless of collective security commitments.